So a very good evening to one and all present here. My name is Gaurav, and I shall be a host for this evening. Our guest is Dr. Bo Bennett. He's the author of many books, and the theme of which specific book that we're going to talk about today is logically fallacious. So we are going to cover various topics of logical fallacies, ad hominems, etc., and also the skills of critical thinking. He's also a very good lecturer who gives talks in various places. And please do check out his website. And he also has a Udemy course. So I suggest that you can all go and avail his course on Udemy, which is quite interesting and will teach you how to combat logical fallacies. So thank you for joining us, Doctor. I'll keep it a very short introduction. So, um, okay, so I'll just ask you a few questions, and then my fellow colleagues can also join in and ask questions if they have. So every time we cover any topic around us, whether it's something that we want to discuss about a movie or even any certain issue that we come across in our lives, we always need to have a conversation. And then conversations can also turn into debates. But there are some, how do I say, hindrances in these conversational patterns that doesn't help us achieve a certain answer or a certain conclusion. So these come in the form of logical fallacies. So what are they? Can you please give us a brief overview on them?
Yeah, you bet. A logical fallacy is basically an error in reasoning. One of the biggest mistakes that most people make is they overuse the term logical fallacy. They call like everything a logical fallacy. Like if you lie, that's a logical fallacy. If you get something wrong, if you mistake, no, those aren't logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are specific because it has to do with the reasoning process. So, for example, if somebody were to make a claim and say the sky is red, and you know the sky is blue, you wouldn't say, hey, that's a logical fallacy, because there's no argument there. They're not saying the sky is red because, and then giving a reason. They're just making a claim. So one of the most difficult things with logical fallacies is really differentiating just a claim from an argument. And arguments don't have to have like premises, like premise number one, two, and a conclusion. They could be implied. So it's not a black and white issue, which of course is one of the fallacies, assuming everything is black and white, like a dichotomy. So there's a lot of nuance to it, and it's just as much of an art, I would say, as it is a science, and that is like determining logical fallacies and errors in reasoning.
Okay, all right. The main intention to combat such logical fallacies is to have a rational conversation. So nowadays, the word rational itself or rationality as a concept itself is thrown around, and many people don't understand what it is. But in your course, you give a very clear and precise notion of what rationality is. Can you please enlighten us on the same?
Sure. Basically, rationality is the process of using reason. Now that may sound a little redundant because you have reason within rationality, but it's coming to logical, sensible conclusions based on valid and good, strong arguments. That's essentially it. And reasoning is different than the process of what's the word I'm looking for? The I guess is a sort of rationalization that it differs from like just trying to explain something away, whereas reasoning you're really explaining it correctly by connecting these valid arguments that logically follow one step to another. You can follow the reasoning patterns, and there's no abrupt break or say, wait a minute, how did you get from that to that? There's something wrong there. It doesn't necessarily follow. So that's essentially the process of reasoning. It's going through that step-by-step process in order to take an argument, to take a claim, and then eventually get to a conclusion.
Okay, just one more question on the lines of rationality as well. Uh, again, as much as this term has been misused or overused, but many people don't even know it, another term or two words that get thrown around is critical thinking, which also comes in your line of work.
Right.
So many people say that use the critical thinking skills, but when asked how do you employ it, they say it's a very tedious process. So I've not done it, but I encourage you to do it. Many people don't do that as well. So in short, what is critical thinking and why is it very necessary for all of us to engage in it?
Yeah, it's funny because critical thinking is like a sense of humor. Everybody thinks they have a great sense of humor, which clearly everybody doesn't. Everybody thinks they have an above average sense of humor, which is statistically impossible. And the same thing goes with critical thinking. Everybody thinks that they are critical thinkers, but they're not. If you go deep on the internet and look at some of the conspiracy websites and some of the forums and just the Facebook posts, they will use the term critical thinking. Like, through critical thinking, I came to the conclusion that lizard people are actually running the world. And this is a good example of people misusing critical thinking. They're just throwing the term out there, like you suggest. It's not, they're not actually using the critical thinking process. They're simply using the term and bypassing the whole process to try to get credit for critical thinking when they're not actually doing it. Now, critical thinking is it's difficult because it's not something that you can easily teach. It's, if you notice, there aren't a lot of courses on critical thinking because critical thinking is really maybe a subset of education. It's more of a meta concept, I should say, where it's involved in everything you do. Critical thinking is basically the process of engaging a higher cognitive function when you're discussing something or thinking about something rather than more the automatic. Kahneman calls these the system one and system two level thinking, where one is very slow and deliberate, and that's where the cognitive thinking comes in, and the other is very fast and quick, and where we just we use most of the time because we cannot possibly devote all of our cognitive resources to critical thinking about everything. So, for example, if we go to the supermarket and we're thinking about what cereal to buy, we're not going to critically think about this topic. We're not going to write down pros and cons. We're not going to think out all the possible scenarios. I mean, we just don't do that. We can't possibly operate as functional human beings, activating that level of thinking all the time. This is why when uh, when people tell us, like, let's go back to the lizard people example, and I was going to say, I apologize if any of our listeners really believe in the lizard people, but if you do, you got some more problems you got to work on, and you need this information. But if somebody were to say about the lizard people, and they say, hey, did you check that out? Did you ever really investigate it? Did you do the research? Here's piles and piles of research. And when they say research, they misuse this, of course. They're probably just posts on forums and the dark web or somewhere. But you say, no, I didn't critically think about this issue to the extent where I did full research, and it's just not something that I am willing to engage in. I could use my system one thinking, and based on heuristics, like reliable heuristics and education, information that I already have, I could pretty much rule this conspiracy or this idea out with 99% accuracy without having to go down that rabbit hole and devote the next year of my life looking at the research. So in a sense, that is, it's kind of a unique situation because you're not critical thinking. You're not critically thinking about that issue, but in a sense you are, again, by using meta principles, by using the education that you already have, by using the rules, the laws of nature, the rules of what actually is what's deemed true. the rules of debunking conspiracies and knowing what conspiracies have legs and which don't. These are like rules that you have critically thought about and developed over time, or you might have, or somebody might have, that you can apply to virtually anything without going down that like a specific rabbit hole. So I hope I answered your question on that to give you a um, good idea of what critical thinking is. It's the ability to use, and it is actually using the reasoning process along with logic and some higher metacognitive principles, where you're taking your time to figure things out and not being persuaded by by ideas like emotional ideas and ideology. And that's one thing that completely destroys critical thinking, is any time that you have a strong ideology, like anytime you're emotionally attached to an idea, whether it be political, you're like a strong leftist or rightist, or you're extremely religious, or you're extremely anti-religious, um, or socially with social issues. Like if you strongly believe that, like anything, take any social issue, like the right to an abortion or something. If you strongly believe that versus strongly pro-life, it's very difficult to think critically, because you don't realize how powerful that ideology is, and it puts you sort of in a bubble where you can't fully activate your critical thinking skills because you're not letting go emotionally. It's the process of compartmentalization, where you're holding on to one idea, and for some reason that one idea, that single idea, is just not. It's you're just not able to use critical thinking to actually to challenge that idea. So that, in a nutshell, is critical thinking and how it relates to reason.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. I'll come back to logical fallacies. So you mentioned that logical fallacies are basically errors in reasoning. Now we face them a lot when we beat any discussion. I think in the American context, something that was very controversial was the vaccine debate. I think so. In that sense, everybody says that
Right.
one of the most common fallacies I think I would have seen at that time, even if I was just looking at from the both sides perspective, was the appeal to authority. So in that sense, so that's one logical fallacy, and ad hominem is another logical fallacy, where you can also insult the character of the other person. So can you please give a few examples of such logical fallacies, and can you please elaborate just a few as to how you can combat them when we're having conversations with others?
Sure. Well, let's use your example of the appeal to authority when it comes to a logical fallacy. Now this works in when it comes to logical fallacies and vaccines, the vaccine debate. Now, this came upon like both sides would use this fallacy. When we're talking about both sides, we're talking about people who are pro-vaccine, who are pro-science for the vaccine, and people who are against the vaccine for whatever reason. They may also claim to be pro-science. So I want to make that clear distinction. Again, it's the idea that everybody thinks they're right. Everybody thinks they're the hero in their own narrative, in their own story. Everybody thinks that they are awesome at critical thinking when it comes to people who are really engaged in this debate, and not people who are sitting kind of on the sidelines and saying, well, look, I'll do what I think is right based on my doctor or something, and I'm not sure, but I trust my doctors, and my doctor says this, so I'll do it. So when it comes to the appeal to authority, you might have the pro-vaccine side who say, well, the CDC or Dr. Fauci says that it's extremely important to get this vaccine, and we have to get it at these intervals, and because it's good or whatever. So therefore, it's right. So notice that distinction. We're not saying I'm going to get the vaccine because Dr. Fauci said so. We're saying it is right, the vaccine is good, the vaccine works because Dr. Fauci said so. So that's an extremely important distinction that a lot of people screw up with the whole appeal to authority. They're saying it's the same thing as like my doctor says I should really watch my weight, And they're, hey, well, that's a logical fallacy. It's like, no, it's not a logical fallacy. I should say, my doctors say I should watch my weight, therefore I'm going to watch my weight. It's basically taking advice. It's basically looking to experts for ideas and opinions and advice, which is something we all do, which is something is extremely good to do because we all cannot be experts on everything, no matter what people say and their Googling skills. You heard the whole idea of the PhD via Google, Dr. Google, being able to go on Google and know more than the experts and researchers and doctors. But that's not how it works. So the idea that the appeal to authority, it would be Dr. Fauci said that it's good. The CDC says it's good. The CDC says it's good. That's the Disease Control Center here in the United States. Therefore, it is. So you're making a factual statement about something based on an authority. Now, if the other side would say, well, I read this research paper by this doctor who would be like an anti-vaccine doctor, who said the vaccines kill everybody and they're horrible and the government's trying to pull a fast one over everyone to control the population, whatever. Therefore, that's true because they're appealing to that authority. They're not saying I'm not getting it because I read this. That would be, that might be a stupid decision, but it's not a fallacy. But they're saying something is true or something is false based on what they read. Now, the appeal to authority is always tricky because, like, where does authority become okay? Like, at what point does authority become valid? Well, there's an appeal to a legitimate or a valid authority, which still is technically an appeal to authority. So it's a matter of looking at the authority and how did the authority come by that decision? And that's the key. So the authority, you could say, well, this authority, this let's say Harvard Medical Center, through years of research and all of these published papers and a consensus of doctors and so on and so forth, all this research, that is what we are actually looking at when we say, well, Harvard said that it's okay. We're not just, Harvard is kind of like a placeholder for all of this research and all of this study. So in that sense, it's not a fallacy and it's not wrong. So that was, I think that's a really good example that you bring up because it's a perfect example of how difficult these fallacies can be. Some fallacies are very easy, like you mentioned the ad hominem. You're going to say like, you're an idiot, therefore what you say is false. Actually, that might be that might be a little bit. There is like a heuristic that you say, okay, if the person is typically stupid, the chances of what they're going to say is false is pretty good, right? So as a heuristic, that might work. Another good example of that is here in the United States, we have, and you probably have them there, like many different media sources. Some are extremely reliable, whereas some are extremely opinionated on different sides of the political spectrum. And some are just like always wrong. They're conspiracies. They're more for entertainment than they are for news. So if you get something from that source, you could say, well, that source is always, or like typically always wrong, therefore I could say it's wrong. So that's essentially the ad hominem, is saying like, okay, you're not very smart, therefore everything you tell me is wrong. No, that's not true. It could be the case that this person knows this one thing and knows it well. So you can't jump to that conclusion. That's not a good reason. That's an error in the reasoning process. So we say that's a logical fallacy. With the ad hominem, people will often say, like in a debate, they're going to say, they're going back and forth and it gets heated, and they're going to say, you know what, well, you're just a moron. And they're going to say, well, that's an ad hominem. Well, no, not technically, because you're not saying because you're a moron, therefore what you're saying is wrong. They're just out of anger or out of haste, they're saying you're a moron. So that's just an insult. It's not technically a logical fallacy. So you could see the different logical fallacies. That's just like a sampling, or a couple of them, as you mentioned, with the nuances. And one thing I want to point out there is virtually every inductive logical fallacy, that's not a deductive where you could put in a formula. Like, it's not a problem with the format of the argument, but it's more of a problem with the idea. Virtually every inductive logical fallacy is an argument in itself. Another good example, I'll throw one more in there, is this idea of a strong argument, or I'm sorry, let's go with a weak analogy, strong analogy or the weak analogy. When you say this is like this, so therefore it's wrong, or something like that. How do you define weak? What exactly is weak? Of course, now we get into subjectivity, because you're going to say, well, that's not really like that, so that's a weak analogy. And you could say, oh no, that's exactly like that. And you could both have your arguments and reasons why, but you could see how that's kind of like an argument in itself, whether it is a weak analogy or not. So whenever you see somebody post like, hey, this is a logical fallacy, the chances are it might be, but it might not be. And it depends on the subjectivity of the audience who is listening to the argument, reading the debate, whether they agree that this is a fallacy or not.
All right. Just moving on to that, you had mentioned that, in the beginning, that we human beings should, how do I say it? Overcome their emotions. So you also talked about appeal to emotion and appeal to fear as logical fallacies as well. Can you please tell us about using an example as to, how they differ and what they exactly are?
Sure. The appeal to emotion is sort of like a category of fallacies. And under appeal to emotion, you have appeal to fear, appeal to happiness, appeal to envy. I mean, you could just go on with virtually every emotion, every human emotion that there is, and you could say appeal to. The appeal to emotion is essentially, we'll just stick with that for now. It's essentially the idea that, look at me, I'm really sad. I've lost everything because I took a job at this company. Therefore, this company is a fraud, or this company is bad. So your whole argument as to why the company is bad has to do with an emotion. Like, and you see this all the time. Emotion is extremely strong and powerful in argumentation, and it's not always fallacious. It's only fallacious when you use emotion as a substitute for logic or reason. So again, with my example, look at me. I lost all my money. I lost my house. I lost my wife. I lost my kids. I'm living on the street, all because I took this job. Well, is that really true? I mean, you feel bad for the guy, right? You would say, like, oh my goodness, this is terrible. But you can't connect that to the claim that the company is fraudulent or the company is bad. You need evidence, you need reason. Now, where does that come into play? Let's say that there was somebody who said, okay, look at me, I lost my job, I'm homeless, I'm on the street, and here is a stack of evidence, documents showing how fraudulent this company is and how they treat all their employees this way and destroy their lives. And you can list off the evidence. That's perfectly fine. As Aristotle said thousands of years ago, you can't win an argument, or I paraphrase, of course, but the idea was you can't win an argument with logic alone. It doesn't do the trick. You need more than that. In order to be really persuasive, in order to be a really good speaker, you have to bring emotion into it, because we're human. The majority of us, without maybe the few percent, 5% of sociopaths and psychopaths who don't respond to emotion, we really do respond to emotion, and it helps us to connect the dots. It helps us to take action. So when you see a plea for charity, a good plea for charity will certainly include emotion. Like me, I kind of fall apart when I see like dead dogs, and not dead dogs, but just like sick dogs and sick animals and like living on the street. I mean, it's probably the most emotional thing for me, and I'll throw money at them just based on that. But if you could say, like, for example, like you should help dogs, and here is why, because dogs have incredibly high cognitive skills and cognitive function, and they're extremely emotional, and it's the right thing to do if you care about humans and you care about sentient beings, and you go down that you throw some of the logic and reason in there, and then you also show the sick dogs. Well, that really gets them. That hammers it home. So the appeal to emotion, you could have an appeal to emotion, which is perfectly fine, and then you could have the appeal to emotion, which is fallacious. And that, again, is when you completely leave out all the reason and rationality and you just focus on the emotion.
All right. You've mentioned about evidence. I'll come to that in just a minute. But before that, in many events or in many debates or whatever, anything, even a simple question that's being asked by people, I've seen that people make this claim that they believe that words are violence. And any question, whether it's about a marginalized community or even about any other topic involving them, they always make a claim that such questions, such statements are going to lead up to violence, even though it's just simple questions or anything, anything else with respect to wanting to know about the world. What sort
Right.
of a fallacy is this? And how do we convince the other person that I have no intentions of causing violence, I have no intentions of ill behaviors or any ill intentions towards the others? But I just have a simple question, but you're claiming that my words are going to be causing violence. So is there any specific term for such fallacy, or is it that it's just some random dogma that these people follow?
It is closer to a dogma. It is closer to a claim without evidence. So they're saying words cause violence, and that's you could say that's ambiguity fallacy. That's because that's very ambiguous. Uh, do words cause? Well, if somebody in power says, "See that guy over there? Kill him now," and I will not hold you accountable for that. Well, those are words. That's definitely going to cause violence. In that case, sure, yeah, words cause violence. Or if you have like a leader who tells everybody, riles everybody up, and says, "Go get them and attack them and kill them and fight for your life," yeah, sure. I mean, that's not good. So that's where they get away with it because anybody could see that, and you could say, yeah, okay, I see where words are violence. But now people will use that idea to say, well, should we really have a man with a beard be able to use a female bathroom just because they identify as a woman, although they haven't transitioned, they're just, they look like a man. Is that really a good thing? Like, how would you feel as a woman? Like, whoa, you can't say that. Words are violence. You're bigoted by even suggesting that. Well, that's completely different. You could say, like, you want to engage in this argument. There may be some really good reasons why that is the case, and you want to hear them. And there may be some really good reasons why that shouldn't be the case, and the other side should hear them. So this is where, like, you should always have the discussion and the debate. And I think that anybody really concerned with critical thinking, logic, and reason should be willing to take the metaphorical bullet when it comes to being called a bigot, when it becomes to inciting violence with your words, being called a racist, being called homophobe, whatever, because those words are thrown around like all the time now, and they have pretty much lost all meaning when you see somebody who's fought for, let's say, gay rights their entire lives, and they said something that the gay community didn't like, and now they're a homophobe, right? And you're comparing that to somebody who actually is like kills gay people, like throws them off buildings in another country. And how could you compare the two? It doesn't even compute logically. It's crazy. So, like, in this sense, the words have lost meaning. So when people try to dissuade you from discussing an issue, because of like words or violence, or because you're bigoted or racist or whatever. You have to say, okay, yeah, that's what you think, but let's forget the name calling and let's move on and just answer the question, or let's have the discussion. It happens all the time. It happens more frequently, and it's unfortunate. But I think we need more people to, like I said, be willing to take the metaphorical bullet, be labeled a racist, be labeled whatever, and bring up these questions that 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 need to be asked, and the discussions that need to be had.
Okay. All right. Now I'll come to faith and religion because you spoke about a bit of evidence. So notorious atheist Christopher Hitchens had made a dictum, said that absence of evidence, I mean, anything asserted with absence of evidence can be dismissed without evidence as well. So in the realm of talking to religious people, because what I've also observed is that everybody believes in their own religion, in spite of all the irrationalities that someone else would point out. But they would be so, so enthusiastic to point out the irrationalities in other religions, but not their own. And it's very hard to have conversations with people because, as we know, but that faith is something that the belief without evidence. So, what are some fallacies that you've encountered or you've seen in having conversations with religious people, for that matter?
Well, the biggest one is the gap of the gods, which the whole idea of like we don't know how something happened, therefore God must have done it, or the gods must have done it. It's along the same lines of it's appeal to ignorance, basically, is the fallacy, and the appeal to magic is the other one. When you kind of can't figure something out, we don't have the answer to it, so we insert magic, and now we got the answers. And that's the part that doesn't that is fallacious. And this is a difficult conversation to have with people of faith or religious people, because they like to turn it around and say, well, you're saying that everything was done naturally. And you're saying you don't know how it was done, so it's probably done naturally. Well, there's a difference, and there's a bunch of differences. Well, one is, well, everything that we thought was supernatural that we figured out had turned out to be natural. Everything. 100% of the things that we thought at some time in human history were done by the gods, were done by the heavens, were done by some magic, force of magic, fate, whatever. Anytime we actually figured out, which is millions of times, it was natural. So coming to that conclusion that, okay, we don't know exactly how life began, but if I were to guess, I would say there's a natural explanation for it. That's completely reasonable. Whereas inserting, it's not just inserting magic and saying, well, I think, I have faith, so I think that God probably did it. It's not that. It's saying that, oh, I know God did it. It's that level of confidence. The higher the level of confidence in something unknown makes it more fallacious. So when you have people who, you could see people who are faith, but are also like good critical thinkers. But again, they compartmentalize that one issue. They may be like the rational type that says, you know what, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's a God or not. I think like I was brought up, I was raised in this religion, so I have this ongoing feeling that there is like a God, some type of God being that may have like started everything, that may have like everything was started. So it's a very generic kind of God claim. And you could see how that would be more reasonable than I believe in Jesus Christ, who was raised after 3 days, who heals people. And if you pray to him, your prayers will come true if you pray in groups of two or more. Like all these extremely specific doctrines, whether it be from Christianity, from Hinduism, from name the religion, they all have them. So you could see where accepting one idea, just like this ambiguous God claim, would be less fallacious because you're not jumping to as many conclusions. You're not inserting magic in as many places as you need to. You're not coming up with answers. You're trying to rationalize which is the process of coming to a conclusion, basically starting with a conclusion and then rationalizing, working backwards to find the reasons and find the answers. And that's what's done a lot with religion, is this process of rationalization. So you could find a lot of fallacies in there. And to be fair, I would say that depending on who the atheist is and how they became an atheist, if they were always an atheist, they may have like fallacious reasoning as well, and they may jump to conclusions, and they may come to have like the whole range of fallacies. Religious people are not the only ones that use fallacies to defend their religion, but it also happens to from atheists who use fallacies to defend their non-religious beliefs. Again, it all depends on the argument they're making, and not just the claim, but the reasons why. And that's where you could find the fallacies.
Okay, I'll stop, but I just want to know if any of the participants have any questions directly to you. They have the option of unmuting and asking you directly as well. I wait for 2 minutes and see if anybody wants to ask you. So I request participants, if they have any questions to the speaker, I request you to please ask him directly as well. I'll just wait for a minute and I'll see what
Sure,
happens.
you bet. Happy to wait.
Does nobody have any other questions? Are you all fine? Can I proceed? Okay, all right. It's okay then. I'll take that as a no for now, but I'll still continue with certain more fallacies. Okay. Continuing with the notion of evidence, in sense that when we start saying, for example, when we start making a claim about anything, we start citing research papers and other things as well. But still, there would be incorrect information in that. I'm not talking about misinformation and disinformation, but incorrect information, like and or incorrect interpretations of the scientific method, which would have been applied to that. So in the realm of actually debating with evidence, how do we combat this as well, and what sort of specific fallacies would this come under?
Well, I think it's really scientific knowledge education that will combat this. People have to be knowledgeable with the scientific method. They have to be knowledgeable with the various degrees of evidence, and there is a slightly different degree of evidence and type of evidence if you're speaking about something in the legal realm versus the scientific realm. So I don't really get involved with legal issues because I know that that's a little bit different, and I'm not a lawyer. Um, but it's sort of the same, with one huge difference. Like if you notice and I'm sorry with my ignorance about how the legal system works in your country, but in our country, it's you have lawyers, what are called lawyers, who argue. They're like assigned to a side, whether it be the defendant or the plaintiff, and their job is to do their best to argue for their client, whether they're right or they're wrong. So it's very different than science. In science, we don't do that. We're not. That's essentially, if you look at like what's called like a Christian apologist, they're like a lawyer for God. Their job is to do their best to argue for the faith no matter what. Their job is not to come to the right conclusion. Their job is not to find that they already think, they believe that they know the truth. So there's no use in looking for it, or there's no use in debating about it. Their job is to argue for their side. With science, it's very different. You don't have a side, or at least you're not supposed to. There are no sides here. If you're a researcher who does, let's say, research on, let's stick with vaccines, then you put out your research and you want the kind of feedback. You want other research to prove you wrong. And that's what's called falsifying information. So when somebody puts out research, we never say that, okay, this is true. we say that this has yet to be falsified. And we're waiting for some research to falsify the data. Then we could throw that, scrap that away, and then something new might take its place. But what happens a lot is instead of falsifying the data, other research comes out supporting the data. So it means, well, we went about it a different way and we came to the same conclusion. Or we reproduced your experiment the way that you did it and we came to the same conclusion. The more people, the more authorities that do that, like universities, not just in the United States, but all around the world, all different cultures, all different, like there are little variations on the way people do things, but they're all using the same scientific method. It's like the universal language, kind of like math. Uh, Everybody comes to the same conclusion, then you have a convergence of evidence is what it's called. So when you have this convergence of evidence, that's when you could say, okay, we've got a really strong, either whether it be a theory or a fact at that point, scientific fact, scientific theory, and that is the de facto until somebody else uh, proves it wrong and comes to the opposite conclusion. And basically, the convergence, the paradigm shifts from one idea to another. Now, I have to say that that's extremely rare, and off the top of my head, I can't think of any cases where somebody said, well, this is right, and this was the paradigm for so long. Well, maybe I could, the flat earth, but that was pre-scientific, right? That was before the scientific age, and even I guess I forgot what it was, hundreds of years ago, maybe even 1,000 years ago, some culture knew that the earth was round for whatever reason. So it wasn't like way out there, but the whole idea, the primary idea, the paradigm was that there was a flat earth. Then science came along, and that notion was blown away by at least 99.99% of the population. There's still that 0.001% who's out of their minds, and you could find them on the internet, but that's a whole different story. But the paradigm shifts, like for example, when Newton came along and had the Newton laws, and then Einstein came along, we didn't say, okay, Newton was wrong. Einstein just built upon it. It took Newton's laws, and those are still completely valid, and then you just have something on top of that. So we know more about it. And that's basically how we build up evidence. So we very rarely, my whole point about saying this, going down this little path, is that somebody's not going to come along and say, you know what, the earth really is flat. Or you know what, the earth really was created 6,000 years ago. It just does not happen. The chances of something like that happen are, astronomical. I mean, it's every piece of information converges on these ideas that we have known for so long. And that's how we build up our scientific knowledge. So when people refer to evidence, again, that term gets thrown around like words are hate, or words are hate speech, or words are violence, whatever. What is evidence? Well, somebody could say, well, I was watching this YouTube channel and this guy said something crazy, so therefore that's evidence. They refer to a YouTube link as evidence. Like, no, okay, well, that you could say, like, technically you could say that's evidence, fine, but it's extremely weak evidence. So I don't like getting into the debate with people, what is evidence and what is not evidence. Let's just call everything evidence. Why not? But let's say the strength of the evidence is what really matters. So you could actually look up online and you could find hierarchies of evidence, scientific evidence. You could start with, like, word of mouth, and then you could start with somebody telling you something, and then it goes up the ladder all the way up to the meta-analysis, which is kind of like the pinnacle of scientific evidence. That's when you take all the papers in the field, or not even all of them, but just even like a large selection of them, a random selection. You put them all together and you analyze everything, and then you come to an ultimate conclusion. That is kind of like the pinnacle of scientific evidence. And then again, look it up online. I don't know all the steps, but there are a lot of steps in between of different types of evidence. So with good critical thinking, you have to be able to evaluate evidence and give it the right type of strength when it comes to your argument, rather than thinking of evidence as binary. So like, oh, I have evidence for my crazy belief, therefore it's true. Well, somebody else could have better evidence against your crazy belief. So therefore, you have to take that into account. Just don't look at evidence as a binary construct, because it's not.
All right. Do you have another 10 minutes? Is that fine with
Sure.
you?
Yeah.
Okay. Uh, so most of my most of my colleagues are also going to have a course on statistics. So there's this particular fallacy called lying with statistics itself, and
Yep.
I've seen it everywhere almost. And then only when I go, people used to send me papers that they haven't even read, and when I try to access them, there used to be a barrier. You have to pay for this and not. If you could, if you could read that and you could send me this, you should have read it. But why are you sending me something where there's a paywall for something? So I knew that they didn't read it, so but they said here's a statistic for it. So can you please enlighten us, tell us more about lying with statistics?
Sure. Lying with statistics have been around for a long time. And one of my favorite examples of that is to try to get somebody to respond emotionally. It's basically a deception technique. Uh, you're deceiving somebody by making them think something is a lot worse or better than it actually is. So a good example of this is during COVID. Uh, if you want to tell the public that COVID is horrible and it's the worst thing and it's an incredibly important thing to be concerned about and we should all be scared out of our minds, then you could say, over the last week, COVID cases have tripled, right? And you're like, wow, that's really scary. Tripled. That's a statistic. They have tripled. What does that mean in absolute terms? If you look closer, you may say, okay, over the last week, there was one case, and now there's three cases. Now you're going to say, okay, well, there's three cases of COVID. That doesn't sound too scary. Like, let's say this isn't the beginning of COVID, but this is, whatever, this is into COVID. And I've seen that a lot. So you're not, whatever sounds more scary, what the message that you're trying to get across, you could choose to use either absolute statistics or you could choose to use relative statistic, like percentage wise, whatever sounds more scary, whatever hammers in your point. So you're lying essentially, you're deceiving people by giving them not the whole truth, but the part of the truth that you want to tell them. Another example is when you see like increases and decreases in bar charts. What's really funny is sometimes they won't start at zero, right? So always look for that in bar charts, because if you start like at zero, say 0 to 100, uh, you'll have like the bar chart that's maybe like a couple inches high. And then if the other one is like the major increase is 106, it's going to be a tiny bit bigger, right? So you have the 100 and the 106, which is a tiny bit bigger. But what if you pull that trick in statistics where you start the bar chart at say 95, right? That's the zero, that's the starting point. So now you have four, and then, so the four would be this big, and then you have the 4 plus 6, you have the 10, which is twice as big. Now that looks scary. That looks like a huge increase. It could be a line graph. They do that with line graphs as well. So that's another way of communicating your ideology, your idea that you're trying to sell without telling them the whole truth. So any good statistician, any good mathematician, scientist, scientific communicator would tell the whole truth, not just a part of the truth with statistics. And that is important to know, because even in legitimate science, there are scientists who are passionate about their area that are trying to sell you an idea that may not be the full truth. Although the statistics are 100% accurate, again, they're not wrong, they're just misleading. So you need to be able to see those tricks and see through that. And a guy named Daryl Huff has a very good book on this that goes through this in detail. He actually wrote in the 50s, 1950, 50 something, and you can find that on the internet. So if you're interested in that, look it up.
All right. I'll just wrap it up with the last two things. First one is circular reasoning or circular arguments, and the next one is moving goalposts. These two fallacies. Can you give us an example of where you've seen this, and is there any other fallacy that you find to be a favorite one because of how humorous it's been in your arguments? Any one of them. I mean, you can either take that or this question.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'll quickly go with it. Your question about the ones that I find most humorous. It's the circular reasoning one. I always find that funny because if you like watch movies, some of the best humor is in that fallacy. They do circular reasoning, and I forgot there's a scene on the movie Fletch. If you're familiar with that movie Fletch with Chevy Chase, he does this little trick to get some information, and he says like I'm Frida's secretary, who's Frida, or no, I'm Frida's boss, who's Frida, my secretary, and that gives no new information, but he's able to get the information just by like manipulating them. He does this little circular reasoning. He doesn't show his importance, who he really is. He just connects himself to somebody else and connects them back. Another common one is that you see is with the Bible or holy books. Christians will say, well, they believe in God because it's in the Bible. Well, why do you believe in the Bible? Because it was written by God. So like, wait, what? So that's a complete like circular logic that doesn't make sense. It's like getting the email from the prince of one of these countries, and the prince tells you that they've got a fortune for you, $20 million. You just need to send them some money in good faith, and they'll give you that fortune. And then you go back and you tell your friend, oh, I got that. I'm so excited about this. But why would you believe that? And they say, well, because in the email, he said this was legitimate and he was the prince. So he told me in the email that it was legitimate. So, and you say, you can't do that. That's circular reasoning. You believe him because he said so in the email that he wrote. So that's one of the most humorous ones that I see an awful lot, and unfortunately, people don't always get it. People don't always see the logic in that. And if you want, I'll answer your other question too. You mentioned two fallacies. What was the first one?
The first one was circular reasoning. The second one was moving goalposts.
And say the first one more time. I'm sorry.
This first one you've already spoken. It was circular reasoning or circular
Oh, circle.
arguments for that matter. So I'm sorry. I mean, in the sense you've already spoken about the first one.
Okay.
Then you said it was a favorite one. So I think the last one we'll talk about is moving goalposts. Yeah.
The moving goalposts, that's common too, because whenever it's common in debate, because somebody will say, well, this is the reason why this is true. And then the other side will say, well, actually, that reason isn't valid because, and then they give a really good reason. And they say, well, it's also true because of this. And they say, well, and then say, well, it's not because of this. Well, what about this? So what they keep on doing is they keep on insisting it's true without conceding the point that okay, yeah, that was a bad reason. So they keep on moving the goalpost to make it more and more difficult to prove that false, to prove their claim false, and they just keep on pushing it back. Once more, going to religion, this is a fallacy that's been going on for millennia. Well, God exists because how else does the sun go around the earth? Apollo pulls it around in his chariot, right? And say, well, we eventually say, well, there is no Apollo. He doesn't pull it around. It has to do with the rotation of the earth and whatever. And I say, okay, well, what about a tree, or like how could a tree be here? And then you say, well, a tree is here because, and then you go into biology of it and how it comes from a seed and so forth. And they say, okay, well, what about life in general? How did that begin? They may say, well, how did people evolve? And then you explain evolution, and then they say, okay, well, that's explained. But what about this? But what about this? And there's always going to be something. And at some point, like the rational thinker would say, okay, maybe my ultimate conclusion isn't right. But when moving the goalpost, you don't do that. You're not thinking clearly. You just keep on thinking, I'm sticking with my conclusion, and I'm going to keep on rationalizing. I'm going to keep on coming up with another reason. Well, what about this? Well, what about this? Or how about this? And I'm never going to let go of this conclusion, no matter how many times all of my reasons get refuted.
All right. I think we'll conclude this here. But I have one last question, or rather, it's more of what advice would you give to us? Because we also are going to go into debates, and we're trying to, enhance our critical thinking skills as well. So, to our students, what would you like to tell us in order to
Sure.
become better people?
Well, there's two different pieces of advice there. One, if you're critical thinking advice, I would say do your best to get rid of all of your ideologies. Do your best to be neutral about everything. To say like, I don't care. I will go where the evidence leads me. And that's very difficult for some people because some people have strong religious beliefs. Some people were born into a very religious environment. So getting rid of that is extremely difficult. But you have to be at a point where say, I don't care if there's a God or the gods. I don't care which religion is right. I want to know or if any religion is right. I want to know, I want to have the best information, and I want that to make a decision. Same thing with politics. You have to say like I basically don't care. I just want to know what's right, and try not to take sides. Like with religion and with politics, like you don't have to choose a religion, a packaged religion. You could say, I like this part from Buddhism. I really like how this works, and I think there's some evidence for this being effective. I like this part from Christianity. You could pick and choose. Why not? That's fine if that's the conclusion you come to. Same thing with politics. You don't have to, and I think it's horrible that like in the United States, we have the left and the right. We have conservatives and we have Democrats and liberals and Republicans. You need to be able to say, I think these people, this side has a good idea. I think this is right, but they're completely wrong on this. And you should be able to see every single issue independently and not make judgments based on your ideology. And the same thing goes with social issues as well. I mean, there are some really good social issues and there are some really bad ones. And you have to stop this need to identify, to feel like part of this group. And I know that's a strong human need, and that's why we do it. But you have to, as a good critical thinker, as a good rational person, you have to be able to separate yourself from the group. Picture everybody in all these groups and picture yourself stepping out of the group and being alone and saying, you know what, I am going to take the best pieces and the correct pieces of all these different groups, if there are. Maybe one group will be 100% right if that's the case. But don't try to build your identity around somebody. Build your identity as an individual. That's your identity. Your identity is a good critical thinker. That's your identity. Everything else, doesn't matter. Get out of this whole identity politics thing, and don't fall for this desire to be part of a group when that requires compromise. And you don't want to deal with that. So that's one piece of advice. Now, debate is a different thing because, as I mentioned before, there are lawyers and there are scientists. When you're debating, the goal of the debate, I'm assuming in like competitive debate or something, is to win the debate, right? It's there may be like an academic debate. The goal is to come to the truth. We're saying, okay, we're two people here with different ideas, and we have to agree that our mutual goal is to come to the truth, no matter what that truth may be. That's like scientific debate. In academic debate, in competitive debate, and I'm not sure what kind of debate you guys are into, but it may be to argue like a lawyer, to come to the best, to make the best case for your side. And in school, we do that. You say you're going to defend this position which you don't believe in or you don't think is right, but that's part of the task to defend a position, and that's the academic process of it. That's the academic part of it. So in that case, you need to think more like a lawyer, and you do need to avoid the fallacies. Absolutely, you don't want to be called out on fallacy. You want to think logically. You want to think rationally. You want to show your audience that you are thinking logically and rationally, and you also want to use emotion. You definitely want to bring emotion into that debate to connect to people that way. And then what you would want to do is you would want to leave out the information that's inconvenient to your argument and wait for the other debater to bring that up. Um, again, that's a completely different game, and I do see that more as a game as opposed to like an academic endeavor, like the scientific debate. But anyways, there it is.
Anyways, thank you so much once again, audience members. This is Dr. Bo Bennett. I request you to go check out his website. He has a lot of work over there. And if you have a Udemy account, I actually would like request you to go and do his course. All the logical fallacies are conveyed in various videos and particular sections as well. So once again, thank you so much. And to our speaker, Dr. Bo Bennett, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I'm sorry, it's morning in your side. And we hope to see you sometime soon. So I
All
hope
right,
that
thank you
you
so much
you'll
for having me.
come. Okay,
It was, I
bye-bye.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you so much, sir.